where do we start? In each of your areas, can you describe explicitly the values and issues that immigrants and the U.S.-born share? Rachel, we can start with you.
Thanks, Denzel. And can you hear and see me okay? Let me confirm that first. Okay, great. First of all, thank you for putting this webinar on. It's really great to be with you, and I hope I can add something to the fantastic points that have already been shared. I think one of the things that we've learned over the last decade or so in Welcoming America's work is that one of the reasons why we're all here talking about the narrative is that our communities have changed, and that is a point of stress and challenge, because it's an experience that can be really alienating if you're a new person coming into a community, but it can also be really alienating experience if you're somebody who's lived in a community all your life and are seeing it change. And in that challenge, I think, is also one of our greatest opportunities, which is to recognize that we all deeply want to belong. And that is a commonly held desire that we all share, and that is also made really difficult in that process of change. But I think the opportunity in that is to make the act of welcoming truly be about everyone belonging, about everyone thriving, about everybody being lifted up. And when we do that, when we recognize that to be welcomers, we also have to feel welcomed, that for the communities that receive immigrants to be able to integrate and include immigrants in a successful way, they too also need to feel like they belong. Then we enter into a whole new conversation, which isn't just about how we frame the issue, although that's important. It's actually about how we do the work. How can we do this work of lifting up immigrants in a way that actually lifts up our whole community and makes everybody feel like they belong and are part of the future of that community? And I know we'll have more time for me to share some examples of that, but I think that is an important starting point, certainly for us, and for reframing this issue.
Sarah, you might find that idea of welcoming, that idea of belonging for people in rural areas to be very, very challenging, right?
Absolutely. Can you all hear me? Yes. Okay, wonderful. Well, thanks again for the invitation to join you this afternoon. I've been working on immigration issues here in the Midwest for nearly a decade, but I wanted to share quickly some reflections from a very eye-opening trip that I took recently to two small towns in rural Nebraska. Lexington and Madison are communities of 10,000 and 2,600 people respectively. And they previously looked a lot like what we would expect rural Nebraska to look like, majority white, very homogeneous. But then meatpacking plants arrived in the late 80s and early 90s, and that launched a demographic transformation. These two communities, 30 years later, now have large immigrant populations. The majority are from Latin America, and each town has more recently welcomed refugees from Somalia and also from Myanmar or Burma. These communities now, I would argue, are just as diverse as my neighborhood of Rogers Park here in Chicago. But I observed that the people in these towns are united by some core values that I don't necessarily see in the city. And I wanted to offer these up as places to start as we discuss ways to build common ground. So the first is that these folks really did share an affinity for small town living. Many chose to live there, particularly refugees that had been resettled in larger U.S. cities and then opted to move to these smaller communities. Folks in these places value family, they value hard work, and they're guided by strong faith. They've chosen again to live here because they're great places to raise children. And the kids, just as we saw in the video that Marissa shared, are growing up together, they're going to school together, they're participating in sports together, and they're really building a new multicultural generation for these towns. The people in these places work shoulder to shoulder in the meatpacking plants. It's hard work. No one's going to argue with that. And there they build on the lines a mutual respect for each other's work ethic that I would argue has helped to transcend language or cultural differences in these communities. And then finally, while the people in these towns may practice different religions, these places were predominantly Christian, and the arrival of newcomers has incorporated Islam and other religious backgrounds into the communities. While there's different religions in these towns, everyone seems to share a strong faith. A faith in a higher being that guides a moral compass, that guides decision-making, that guides kind of a shared optimism about the future. And I would argue that these all serve sort of a base for building common ground and transcending differences. And I would say that these small towns have a lot to teach us about what welcoming and integration can look like in other parts of the country. And I just wanted to share a quick note. This Nebraska trip and some of these reflections will be released in a paper that's being published tomorrow with the Center for American Progress. I'll share a link to a live stream panel that folks can tune into if they want to learn more.
Thank you, Sarah. We will be emailing the link to that report once it's out. And you spoke about these things that they share in common: a common work ethic, loving the small town feel, but even though they come from different faiths, they have this strong belief in something. Westy, can you speak a little bit about, in terms of faith audiences, what can we identify to audiences of faith, these newcomers who look different, who speak with an accent, actually share something very deep with us, right?
Well, I think it begins with the fact that welcoming the stranger is about as basic to the faith community as any single message: to treat others as we want to be treated, the golden rule. And it comes down to our great religious narratives about ourselves, our own faith experience. When the travel ban came up, I appreciated that ADL across the country had their Passover Seders on the freedom theme. Passover is about freedom from slavery. And they made a real point of the fact that the Passover is a celebration of the stranger, the alien, seeking a promised land, and did a wonderful job with the Kiddush that was written specifically to celebrate freedom for those who are aliens and strangers. I think we need to come back to our roots often to find where we are, that allows people on both sides of political opinion that might be in the pew to feel that this is a narrative that somehow touches the core of their faith. I encourage churches, for instance, to stop and celebrate the week after Christmas, when the gospel narratives tells about the slaughter of the innocents, that Mary and Joseph took their baby Jesus and fled government oppression, the killing of the innocents. They had to flee from Bethlehem and flee into Egypt as refugees. What a marvelous story to tell, and what a timely time to tell the story. And I think the same thing over and over again as we come back to the stories, that these are the stories that form our faith, and they need to be stories that are told intentionally, to look for the passages in the Hebrew scriptures that talk about leaving the first yards in the first rows in the garden for the stranger and alien who's passing by so that they'd be fed. To think about the fact that when we entertain strangers, we may be entertaining angels unaware. I love these passages of scriptures, and I think that they are so important to the faith community because they provide a basis that's not political. And for me, a big part of the battle is to get it out of the politic. I mean, we are so tribal in this Republican Democratic country right now that if we can call people back to other kinds of values and do a lot of what Marissa was talking about, we put people in a frame in which they can have a conversation that relates to their own story, their own underpinning, as opposed to what the press is describing as being a pressing issue.
That's an excellent point, Westy. And taking that intentionality of these stories, Marissa, how do these things shape our conversations and our campaigns? Especially in our conversations, how do we respond to others? Can you give us some starting points? Assimilation, jobs, crime. We just saw that the economic concerns, that's one of the biggest fears. Where do we start?
Well, I mean, I think a lot of times, I think if you're the one starting, I think starting with the values is a really useful way to begin. I think one thing that you can do is you can look for bridges in conversations, places where if somebody's talking about jobs, you can talk about, yeah, let's discuss employment and then use that as a bridge to then pivot to shared prosperity, and the fact that when you have a strong immigration system and you have immigrants coming into the country, it actually creates more jobs for every single one of us. So I think being attentive to what other people are saying and finding those places where you can what we call bridge and pivot to the values that you want to use and to the information that you want to use is really important. A lot of times, we end up kind of talking past each other. And instead, that's not to say that you should, if somebody's making a remark that is, not true or racist, that you should say, I understand where you're coming from. I would never advocate that. I think you need to look for those places where you can sort of move them away from where they're going without having to find some sort of common ground that really isn't a common ground. So I think it is about sort of being attentive and being aware and finding the places where there are agreement. And I think that's just one of the beautiful things about values in our culture, is that we have really strong ideas about who we are as Americans, right? Like, we're pragmatic people. We believe in opportunity. We believe in justice. We believe in equality. We believe in the golden rule. And reminding people of those shared values is such a powerful way to get people away from their anger and negativity and sort of more individual ways of understanding or problematizing immigration, and towards a discussion about the collective. And that's the ideal thing. Immigrants are it's not us versus them. We're a nation of immigrants. Immigrants are us. So bringing people along, reminding them of that, that we're a nation of immigrants, are, important things to bring into the conversation.
And Rachel, at taking that not us versus them, that it's something collective, at the municipal level, can you give us some examples of how you use these shared values in campaigns or initiatives?
Sure, let me give you a couple of examples. And I think, as I share these, I want to come to a point that has been made by a few people in chat and also in presentations, which is we're not just talking about the words that we use, although that's important. We're also talking about the relationships that we build and the way in which we do our work. So one example is recently in Northwest Arkansas, a number of leaders in the community came together to create a plan around making that community a more inclusive one. Not just a more inclusive one for immigrants, but truly a more inclusive one for everyone. And some of the values that they tapped into there were the idea of shared prosperity, recognizing that if you're an employer in that community, you want to make sure that you can attract and retain talent. And that means that when people arrive in a community, their kids aren't getting bullied in school and they're not getting dirty looks in the streets. Or if you're just an everyday person in the community, that you too can find your own story in the solutions that are being developed. And what ended up coming out of this plan around inclusion are a lot of things that are good for immigrants: opportunities to learn English, opportunities to buy a home, opportunities to start a business. But those are also things that are good for the community as a whole. Couple of other quick examples. We've seen some great work being done in schools around bringing parents together to talk about what a better education for their kids means, and having a dialogue around that. And the starting point there is not about difference, but about the common point of wanting to see your kids succeed. We've seen great work being done around issues like wealth building and entrepreneurship, looking not only at immigrants or refugee communities, but others who may be like the African American community, who may have historically lacked access to capital. And I think some really deep conversations happening around just the act of moving and being new in a community and what that means, either historically looking back in Salt Lake City, for example, on the experience of people in the LDS church there, and relating that to more contemporary immigrants, I think the key in all of those is really looking at what values are important in a local community, really weaving people together, and finding opportunities to, as I think Sarah was talking about, lift up these examples of where things are already working as positive role models, and help people find their mutuality, not in a paternalistic way that's telling you should have these things in common, but really helping people discover them in the process of developing the policies and designing the kind of community they want to live in.
And you suggested some of the things that Marissa spoke about, which is sort of pivoting to this pragmatic approach. If the moral frame doesn't necessarily work, what benefits everyone? Sarah, have you found that this works? Can you give us any examples from your experience in the Midwest?
Sure, and I'll go back to Rachel's point about not necessarily, it's about the words that we use, and it's also about the actual work. So I think I'm the only Midwesterner on the call, so I'll say that we're extra pragmatic here in the Midwest. A regional stereotype that I've largely found to be true, and certainly found in my travels to Nebraska. The arrival of the meatpacking plants in the two communities initially really divided people. A lot of fear and concern about the unknown. And the two towns experienced some pretty significant white flight, unfortunately. People that didn't want to be a part of the change left. The people that were on board stayed in and rolled up their sleeves. They decided to get to work in building a community where everyone would feel welcomed, much to what Rachel was just describing. These folks visited other meatpacking plants in other parts of the country to try to learn what worked, what didn't work. They tried to be proactive. They connected with other schools and administrators that had experienced for the first time ESL students coming through their doors and trying to understand the different needs of different student populations. They hired translators. They sought resources. They were very pragmatic and practical in their approach in that regard. And 30 years later, the same cohort of people is still very engaged in the work. And when I visited these towns, they told me that they felt called to do it for two reasons. The first was because their Christian faith tells them to welcome the newcomer, just as what Westy was just sharing with us. But secondly, when they saw no other way for their towns to remain vibrant, it was sort of welcome the newcomer or, experience demographic and economic stagnation. The pragmatism won out. And so I would argue that it's really a both and approach.
Thank you. And we have a lot of questions about this legal versus illegal. And I wanted to address that just right off the bat. So many times we hear, oh, we don't have a problem with immigrants, we have a problem with illegal immigrants, or this article is conflating legal and illegal. So we have a question, for instance, from Colleen, people who say that immigrants should wait in line, or from Jerry, how best do we address that issue of illegal versus legal? Westy and Marissa, do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, you've asked me to sort of take a role here for the sake of the conversation today, so let me stick with the faith community response first. I do a lot of fairly good professional advocacy that takes many other tacks, and has to be really a toolkit that responds to different situations in some very different ways. But I think people of faith are people of testimony, of witness, and if you can share a story, it's really powerful. So Denzel and I last weekend were at a dinner together where we met Baba John, who is one of the secondary stars of Black Panther. And here's this wonderful Black figure who is helping the arts and entertainment industry and is starring in Hollywood. But he shared from the brokenness of his heart what it was like to be a DACA recipient and not knowing whether he'll be here next year. And that his success and his contribution to the arts and his desires is not enough right now. That he's without status and can't find a pathway. So he's really hopeful that DACA becomes something that allows for permanent settlement. To share that story over dinner the other day meant that people who, in my circle, would not have entered the conversation necessarily as positively as I do about DACA were willing to hear it. They could hear it and develop some empathy and understanding of an individual. And I think that that's always the key. So when we're not trying to win the argument or have a debate, but we're just sharing the life stories of what it means to be encountering people who are stuck in broken systems, who can't find pathways because we haven't created pathways, who feel hopeless when there should be hope because our country has this great history, because all of us have been, that are here, are recipients of some good measure at some other time, then I find people enter into the empathy with me. And I get excited about sharing stories.
So I think that I would have two sort of recommendations. So the first one is going back to that human dignity value and the idea that people are people, which is something that we know, Americans think about the US and just about people in general, right? Like we're all human beings. And talking about the fact that these are people who are coming to this country for a better life. Not at the expense of Americans, but because they love America and want to join America, right? It's the dream for them. Just like it was a dream for our ancestors. Our ancestors came here looking for a better life because that's what people do. And we have that sort of shared passion with the immigrants of today. And then I think if possible, if you have some time, explaining a little bit about the immigration system. Americans have no idea how immigration works. They don't know that we've created a system that created undocumented immigrants, right? So they don't realize that, when my great-grandparents came here at the turn of the century, there was no such thing as undocumented immigration. So of course they weren't undocumented. So that's the other thing is that, values are amazing at getting people, interested and bringing them in. But then if you have their attention, taking that chance to educate them about the immigration system and about what's actually going on is something that I think you should try and take advantage of.
And you suggest something really, really pertinent there that Laura brought up, which is, my ancestors came here the right way, or my ancestors came here legally. But it taps into not just nationalistic views, this idea of law and order, about abiding by the law, rule breakers, which is also a bit of an American value that, we do things the right way, that we're pragmatic. But have you found good messaging to sort of counter this idea of rule breakers? I don't know if Rachel, have you come across any?
Sorry, countering the issue of people being rule breakers. I mean, I think one of the things that we've tried to do around the issue of immigration is really localize it. And when you're able to get down to the local level, what we're talking about are our neighbors, right? And I think this is part of how we humanize it, just to pick up on the last point. We're talking about our neighbors. We're talking about the children that go to school with our children. And, I think there's a place, I commented earlier in the feed, to not shy away from some of the security or legal or law concerns. And I think that's where we can turn to people who are really trusted messengers on that topic to carry that message, like local police, for example. And I think I don't have a whole lot to add to what has already been shared about the power of stories and the power of leading with the values, and then also explaining to people the facts. But I will say that it is possible for people to change their minds on this issue. And so I would just encourage people to keep at it, because sometimes it feels like we're deeply losing, and that may not be the case.
If I can add to that, Denzel, one of the things I think is important, I like Peggy Levitt's book out of Wellesley College, God Has No Passport. There's a huge difference between sovereignty and global, or spiritual citizenship, citizens of the kingdom of God, or a God who does not see borders or racial differences. We have some obligation, I think, to help people objectify some of these things that become their own mental trap. That right now people are being reinforced in the idea that the sovereign nation and the border is this all-important thing. And you know, people don't realize, as Rachel was saying, or as Melissa was saying, that we have really only created the border in 1923. I mean, we don't even have 100 years on this. We are always in the flux on the question of what it means to have sovereignty and what it means to have porous borders and open borders. But we as people of value understand that people in need are people in need, and that we can have sympathy and want to offer help to folks and trying to find a way to respond that acknowledges the struggle about law and American values, but responds by saying, what do we do to help create good laws so that people can find their way? I think it's not about opposing, it's about moving that energy as we might to work with us to bring about positive change.
And a couple quick questions before we wrap up. Some very technical communication questions. Perhaps, Sarah, should we resist the urge to correct misleading facts and focus on the moral argument, or is there value in making sure people have accurate information? How do we give them that information without losing them?
I'd say that, you know, building on all that's been shared and the perspectives and advice, I would say the most important first step is building this common ground, which is what we've been exploring this afternoon, diffusing this us versus them thinking by focusing on us or we. What do we have in common? What do we all want for our families? What do we want for our future? The answers to those questions probably aren't that different. Spanning the political perspective. And then once that common ground is established via values, via pragmatism, via shared experiences, however you do it, it becomes much easier to move into the complexities of facts, which are increasingly relative these days, and the complexity of systems. And I would echo the other panelists' takeaways that the immigration system is an absolute black box for most Americans. It's an incredibly complex area of law. People have very little working knowledge of how it works. But I think some of these explanations and very wonky technical explanations sort of fall short unless they're tied to someone's lived reality, someone they know, a friend, a neighbor, a coworker. And that's where building that common ground first is an absolute critical step.
And one of the things that we learned, Marissa, is that when it comes to correcting people, we have to avoid restating the myths, right? Why is that?
Because when people hear something that they already tend to believe, it just reinforces in their minds that it's true. So, you know, I think we do have a tendency to try and sometimes create the bridge with somebody by saying, I hear you, or you're right, even though they're saying something that isn't true. But then they just believe the myth, you know, or the misinformation even more than they did. And so this can be really problematic. And one thing I know I've said in previous webinars, and I'll just say it again here, is try not to myth bust, try not to show myth fact type tweets or information. Don't retweet misinformation, because all you're doing is spreading it further. And I think you can make the case about why something is wrong, either without repeating it, or by having it be the second or third thing that you say as opposed to the first thing. Always start with a fact.
I read something very interesting in a just released report from the National Immigration Forum and More in Common about the complexity that you all are suggesting about immigration, but that actually complexity may be a good thing when it comes to talking about immigration. I believe it was Amanda Ripley who said, when people encounter complexity, they become more curious and less closed off to new information. They listen, in other words. So should we therefore combat these sound bites, these myths that we've been hearing all these years that the politicians can repeat over and over again with introducing of this idea of immigration being something more complex? Westy?
Well, it is complex. I would always say this week as we go into Thanksgiving that there's an Uncle Harry in every one of our families. You are not going to win by telling Uncle Harry he's wrong. So the question is, how to talk about the complexity of helping somebody who's trying to adjust status so that there's no line to get in if you're a Mexican. You know, how difficult it is to deal with this complicated system in 22 categories of H visas is really one of those things that I think most people just don't understand. So I wouldn't want to use it as a tool or a weapon, but I would think that occasionally we can reflect back on the struggle and in a humanizing way, talk about the fact that these complex systems are in fact in tremendous need of overhaul, and let that just be said as part of our passing acknowledgments.
Rachel, my penultimate question is going to go to you. Many of us in this webinar want to know, well, you know, okay, in our communications, in our campaigns, we try to follow the things that we learned in this webinar, but what should attendees realistically consider successful or making progress when it comes to what we're talking about here?
Sometimes the simplest questions are actually the most difficult. But I think one thing that's important to remind ourselves is that narrative change and culture change are important to realizing what we want to do on a policy level, and that's why we're all here on this call. And at the same time, narrative change and culture change are about playing the long game, and that takes a really long time. So I actually think one of the most immediate things that we can do, because all of us are incentivized by short-term gains, we're funded to deliver outcomes that are, you know, about getting somebody housed or clothed immediately, not about changing the norms and our culture and narrative. So I think an immediate thing we all need to do is to help persuade those who are around us and who care about this issue just how important it is for us to be connected and resourced and really working to address these deeper narratives. Because if we don't do that, then we're going to continue to be playing on the defense when what we need to do is really be playing on the offense and own this message and really reclaim some of the values that we've all talked about today as being crucial ones for our communities and for our future.
So I want to thank all of our panelists for this incredible discussion. And before you go, I want you to give us your one top tip, the most practical thing that our attendees can do once they leave this webinar to help change the conversation, to open up minds, to correct what's happening in their communities. Wes, you look very thoughtful, so I'll leave you for last. Marissa, we will start with you.
I feel like you already, the myth busting was the one that I would have said. But I guess, you know, my tip would be don't forget how much we have in common. I mean, that's a kind of a high level tip, but I think that we're very caught up right now in a narrative about tribalism and about red states and blue states, and that there are Americans who are just believe one thing and are one side of a divide, and Americans who are on the other side. And I don't believe that. I think we have much more in common than we realize, and we shouldn't fall into that narrative, but find the places where we can, you know, locate our shared values and the bridges in our conversations.
Rachel?
Today's conversation is called How to Talk About Immigrants, but I want to encourage everyone to think about how to talk with immigrants, and that means both centering the narratives that we create from the perspective of immigrants and how immigrants want to be seen, and also just building the relationships between immigrants and others in our communities.
Sarah?
I'll build on the title as well. I think in addition to talking, we need to do a lot of listening. Listening to people who agree with our views and share our lived experiences, and listening to people who disagree with our views and have lived very different experiences. People who we've lived with our entire lives, or newcomers, to Rachel's point. I think we'll find that the two sides of the story are not that different. We all largely want the same things out of life. And that's where we start to build common ground and hopefully some shared solutions on this very tricky topic.
And I would add to that if we put that human face out first, that comes whether it's in the religious worship service or at our Thanksgiving table, I love bringing somebody home to my house. I mean, my life was changed literally by bringing an international student home and heading off then to Kenya to work. My experiences, lives are changed by the direct experience. And as much as we can do it, I think it's great. So make it part of the Thanksgiving celebration, make it part of your worship. Let's find a way where someone's story becomes a story that we can all identify with and want to do something about it.